Thank you everyone for joining. I'm happy to see that we do have a lot of attendees today. I do know that hurricane season is just around the corner, starting in a couple weeks. So I thought it would be good to put on another webinar to explain how our hurricane and tropical storm insurance plans work. And I hope I'm able to provide you with the information today, and then hopefully we'll have time to answer any questions that you might have. So as Brian said, my name is Zach White. I am the director of the Actuarial Prices and Filing Division. I work out of Kansas City. I've been with RMA for over 10 years, and I've worked with HIPWE since its inception. So first, we're going to go over a little bit about the history of the HIPWE program. This started as a result of the 2018 Farm Bill, and RMA got right to work, and we offered it for the 2020 hurricane season, which was good because we had 7 hurricanes that year. I joked that we ran out of the English alphabet and had to start using Greek letters like Delta and Zeta. HIPWE is in addition to your underlying policy, so you have to have a basic amount of coverage first. And HIPWE offers or covers the deductible portion of the policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works later. Immediately following the 2020 hurricane season, we began getting requests for a tropical storm option, which we first offered in 2023. And we've had a busy 2023 and 2024 hurricane season. So we were glad to be able to make that option available. 2 other things to note is that it must be a named storm per NOAA. We get all of our weather data from NOAA. And you also must have HIPWE to get the tropical storm option. The reason for that is that we don't want anyone to only have a tropical storm policy, and then when a hurricane hits, well, they only had a tropical storm policy. So we made sure that you had to get both HIPWE and tropical storm. Okay, so HIPWE and tropical storm are separate, but they both work together. And let's talk a little bit about HIPWE first. Again, as I said earlier, it's an endorsement to your underlying policy, and it only covers the deductible portion, which means that if you select 65% coverage, it will cover between 65% and 95%. So it will cover 30% of your liability. We can't go any higher than 95%. That's something set by Congress. So if you selected 75%, it would cover 20%, the difference between 75 and 95%. We'll go into more detail again on that later. If the policy is too expensive, you can adjust it using the coverage percentage, which you can select between 1 and 100%. So for example, if you selected 50%, you would pay 50% less in premium, but if a payment is due, then you would only receive 50% of that payment. It's just a way to kind of make it adaptable and practicable for everybody. You must have sustained surface winds, which we'll go into more detail later, of at least 64 knots. And I'm not familiar with knots, so I'll try and that's about 74 miles an hour. Again, all that data is from NOAA. It is simple. If those sustained winds hit your county, you're issued a payment. And the payment for HIPWE is 100% of the liability. Now, what about the tropical storm option? Well, the payment is a little bit less. We're kind of assuming that a tropical storm is less damaging than a hurricane. It's only 50% of the liability for the tropical storm option. The trigger is also a little bit more complex. With HIPWE, if you have the sustained winds, you get a payment. But with tropical storm, there's a secondary trigger. You must also you have to have the winds, but you must also have 6 inches of rain over a period of 4 days. And actually, we changed that to 5.9 inches for 2025, but it's just easier for now to say 6 instead of 5.9. We basically said that we're going to round anything at 5.9 or above up to 6. Both the wind and the precipitation have to occur. It's not just one or the other. It is an option, as I said earlier, to the HIPWE endorsement, so you do have to have HIPWE to purchase tropical storm. And lastly, I want to talk about the 4-day window. Why do we have that? Well, We do that for a couple of reasons. And the easiest reason is to uh, collect any precipitation that occurs just ahead of the storm and also any that occurs after the storm leaves. We want to make sure that we collect it all. But it's also to account for different time zones. NOAA's data, as I said, is the data we use, and it's in what's called the Universal Time Coordinated System. When I grew up, it was called Greenwich Mean Time. And that's, for example, that's about 6 hours ahead of Central Time in Texas. And we cover everything from Texas to Maine. And so we have several different time zones. So we just use that. NOAA uses that Universal Coordinated Time. And so that's another reason why we collect a little bit before and a little bit after, is just to account for those different time zones. A little bit about the data. We get as I said, I'll say it all the time, we get all of our data from NOAA. And we do a little refinement on that data as it's spelled out in our hurricane data provisions. That lets us determine the extents of the wind and the county average precipitation. We use census data to get all of the county shapes and locations, but we also have made some slight adjustments for those counties that they look like they're touching, but when you zoom in, they're just not quite touching. And I believe we consider everything that's within 100 meters to be adjacent. Here's where HIPWE is available. All of the colors on the continental United States have both HIPWE and the tropical storm available to them. And Hawaii at this time, only HIPWE is available in Hawaii, but we are working on some options to make the tropical storm option available to Hawaii. HIPWE has been very popular in the first 5 years. The first table shows that the amount of total policy sold and liability. You can see that we have tripled the amount of liability that we have insured in the first 5 years. The second table shows the states where the program has been the most popular. And the third table shows the crops with the most liability over that 5 years. Now, let's get into how this actually works. These first two slides will be pretty easy, but we'll get into some pretty nitty-gritty details after that. I stated earlier that HIPWE only covers the deductible portion of the policy, and here is a graphical depiction of that. In this instance, the policyholder has selected a 65% coverage level, and he has $100 in liability. So the HIPWE coverage is going to be $30 from that 65 to 95% range. He has 65 covered on the base and $30 on HIPWE. $5 does remain as the deductible. If a hurricane were to hit his county or an adjacent county, that payment would be $30. And if tropical storm is triggered, that payment would be $15. Now, I mentioned that tropical storm and HIPWE, they both work together. And here's a few scenarios that I'll walk through quickly. We just talked about A and B, but if you have any combination of storms, you can get paid more. You can get paid up to that $30. You will never get paid more than your liability. And we've had this happen several times in 2024 alone with the storms that we had in the Southeast. I think one county triggered 3 times for either HIPWE or tropical storm. Now here is where we're going to get into the details, and that you'll have to go on a deep dive through the hurricane data provisions to get this information. But this is the actual data that we get from NOAA. This table is fictitious, but this is the type of data that we get from NOAA for the wind extents. Looking from left to right, we get the year, the name of the storm, the UTC time in 3-hour intervals, and at each of those intervals, we get a latitude and a longitude for the center of the storm. The next column is the Saffir-Simpson scale. That's what we think of with a category 1 to 5 hurricane, and the maximum wind speed for the hurricane. You can see that every wind speed is above 64 knots, and they all would register as a 1 or above on that Saffir-Simpson scale. Lastly, we get the maximum extent of the wind, the sustained hurricane force winds in each of the intercardinal directions. That's northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. All of the data you see in this table comes from NOAA except for the last column. That one we create. What we do is we take the maximum extent of each of those four wind extents, and we'll talk about how we use that later. Well, we'll talk about how we use it right now. We plot this all on a map. We take the latitude and longitude at each of those 3-hour intervals. Those are represented by the red X's. After that, we take that maximum wind extent from that table that I just talked about, and we'll draw a circle around each of those center points. And we'll talk about how we connect the circles in a second. But I do want to show you how we handle how storms transition to or from a hurricane or a tropical storm. As I said, we get data every 3 hours, but at some point, the hurricane would stop being a hurricane and would become a tropical storm. So we do a method called interpolation to figure out or to estimate where it stopped being a hurricane. As you can see here, and I'll see if I can highlight this, we have our last hurricane point here. And then the highlighter's not working, but you can see the last hurricane point. And it'll correspond to the second to the last row in our table. The wind speed, you can see, is 70 knots, and the radius was 10 nautical miles. The first tropical storm point is the last row in that spreadsheet, and the wind speed is 60 knots, and the maximum radius for the hurricane force winds is 0 because it's no longer a hurricane, it's a tropical storm. The interpolation is shown graphically here. You can see this line is broken up into 10 different segments of equal distances, each one of those representing the difference between the 70-knot winds and at the last hurricane point and the 60-knot winds at the first tropical storm point. You can see right there where it gets to 64 knots, we draw a circle around that 64-knot center point, estimated center point. The wind extents are either linearly interpolated also, or we put a minimum of 50% of the last hurricane point. Okay, how we take all those circles and we turn it into the wind corridor, we place what's called a convex hole around them. And that's just a fancy geometry term that basically says that it's the smallest set that contains all of the points in a given set. So it's the smallest set that would contain all of those circles. One way to think about it is that it's essentially a rubber band shape that would form when stretched around all the circles. I like to think of it as a tight bike chain around the 2 gears on a bicycle. Each of those consecutive circles from that previous slide has a convex hole around them. And taking all these together, we get our wind corridor. Any county shape that intersects this corridor, it's going to become a triggered county. And later on the slide deck, I want to mention also that if your county triggers, all of your adjacent counties trigger as well. And we'll talk about county adjacency later. This slide shows how we calculate the county-weighted average rainfall for the county. This is the secondary trigger for the tropical storm option. We get gridded precipitation data from NOAA, and those grids, they spread out across the entire United States, and those grids are 1/4 degree latitude by 1/4 degree longitude, which basically means they're approximately 17 miles by 17 miles. I say approximate because as you go further north, they get smaller, and as you go towards the equator, they get larger. NOAA computes the average rainfall for each of those grids, but those grids, they don't exactly line up with our county boundaries, and so we take a weighted average of each one of those grids. Here we have Seminole County, Florida. There are 4 primary grids that make up this county. You can see that there's one small little area to the southeast that makes up 0% of that county. I'm not going to use that in this example, but we do use that when we calculate the county average. So you can see the Northwest grid makes up 19% of the county. The Northeast grid makes up 14%. Southwest makes up 29%, and Southeast makes up 30%. The table to the right, we take the amount of rainfall in each of those grids and multiply that by the percentage of the county that each grid makes up. We take a sum of all of those to come up with the weighted average. For example, it rained 5.5 inches in the Northwest grid. So we multiply that by the 19% that the grid makes up of the county, and we get just a little bit over 1 inch that will be attributed to the county from that grid. When you do that for all the grids, you get a weighted average in this example of just over 6 inches. Now, I do want to talk about how the county adjacency works. So these next few slides are going to build off of each other. This is an example of honeycomb counties, and they're all labeled by their number here. First, we're going to look at the wind speeds. So each of these counties are given whether they are hit by hurricane force winds, and now that's by the HU, or whether they're hit by tropical storm force winds designated by a TS, or whether they were not hit by either hurricane and tropical storm force winds, and then they're blank. So the easy one is for the hurricane force winds. All of these are a direct hurricane trigger, and all of their adjacent counties are also triggered for the hurricane payment as well. All of these counties shown in green will get 100% payment under HIPWE. The dark ones because they're direct triggers, and the light ones because they are adjacent to the direct triggers. Now let's look at the rainfall. These blue dotted areas, these are going to be assumed to have met the 6-inch threshold for rainfall. And here are the tropical storm force triggers for this scenario, and we'll go through these one by one. First is county number 20. It met the rainfall requirements, but you can see that it didn't meet the wind requirements, and you have to meet both. So this county number 20 does not trigger. The next is county number 9. It met the wind requirements, as noted by the TS, and it also met the rainfall requirements with the blue dots. So it triggers itself for a tropical storm payment, but it also triggers counties 2, 3, 8, and 15 because those are adjacent to it. The third one is county number 8. It met the rainfall requirement, and it was also triggered as adjacent to county 9, so it will get a payment, but it didn't meet the wind requirements. So even though it triggered for a payment, it doesn't trigger the counties that are adjacent to it for payment. And lastly, we have county number 18. It is triggered for a hurricane payment through adjacency, so it's going to get the full 100% payment. It also met the precipitation and wind requirements. So even though it triggered as for a HIPWE payment, it also met the tropical storm requirements, and so it's going to trigger all of its adjacent counties for tropical storm, but not for HIP. So those are counties 12, 19, and 25. A little bit about the general timeline for the program. Every storm is different, so this is just a general timeline. But this is from when the storm occurs to when the final hurricane payments are made. First we have a hurricane or a tropical storm event, and within about 2 to 3 weeks, RMA will receive the preliminary wind and rainfall data from NOAA, and so we publish that as soon as possible. We do this because after a disaster, we want to get payments out to those people who are affected as soon as possible. And to my knowledge, this is some of the fastest federal funds that will go out after a hurricane or a tropical storm. And that's one reason why I think this program is so popular, but it's also why it's so important. Second, NOAA does a quality control review of the precipitation data, and within about 2 to 3 months, and generally that's about 60 days after the end of the month that the storm occurs, then they publish the quality control data, and we update any counties that have triggered for a tropical storm payment. Lastly, in the spring following the hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center, they go back and review all of the prior year's tropical cyclones, and they publish their quality control review. Then we take that data and we publish any new HIPWE or even tropical storm triggers. One thing that's important to note is that once we add counties, we do not take them away. So if NOAA's quality control data says that, something should not have triggered and we said it triggered, or they said it triggered, or we published it as triggering earlier, we will not take those county triggers away. And the last thing I want to talk about are just some common misconceptions that we have with the program. And so I want to go through the 4 biggest ones that we have. First is there's a lot of rain gauges across the country. But if we look at the county average precipitation. So just because one rain gauge in the county says that it rained 6 inches or 10 inches, it doesn't mean that the county average was 6 inches. We actually look at that gridded precipitation from NOAA, and we take the county average. Second, we understand that there are damages that occur even outside of where the counties are triggered. But damages are not what the program is designed to look at. This is what's called a parametric insurance program, and that just means that payments are made when the specific metrics that are set are met. Sometimes there's damages that happen when the metrics are not met, the wind and the precipitation. But that's what the underlying coverage is for. This is only for that top layer or deductible portion of the policy, and it only pays when the specific wind and precipitation parameters are met. The next one here is there's a lot of different types of weather stations and weather networks, and NOAA doesn't use all of those. NOAA, the Climate Prediction Center, that's who we use for the precipitation. They only use weather stations certified by NOAA's Office of Observation. They don't use every weather station in the county, only those that are certified by the Office of Observation. And lastly, this is one that we came across a lot in 2024. Hurricane force wind gust can be just as damaging as the sustained winds, but NOAA and therefore RMA only use the sustained hurricane force winds or tropical storm force winds in determining the triggers.